Okay, everybody. Thank you. Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this week's information workshop. This morning, we will be briefed by staff on the next steps of Plan Change 14. The process, then after lunch, we will hear from CCHL. Just a reminder to us all, this is a workshop for elected members to provide guidance to staff that is not a forum for debate or for decisions. It is also not a forum for the public to provide input into decisions or bring the other matters to the attention of council. If a member of the public does want to provide input, please talk to staff and they will help you have your say. So, Mark and John, fire away.
Okay.
Yours.
Thank you. So we just wanted to provide an overview of the process and date of timeline of events with regard to PC 14 today, and just the staging of the decisions and the IHP minute, and then the next steps. But before I sort of get on to the PC 14, I just wanted to sort of highlight that we will be back here on the schedule for the 30th of April, and that information exchange session will be on the broader plan change program. So I just wanted to let you know that. And we have had a question recently about the live music venues work program that's going on, and just reiterating as part of that associated potential plan change with that work is not scheduled for a timing in terms of that work on that plan change. So anyway, I'll get on to PC 14 now. So you'll recall back that notification for submissions occurred between March and May 2023. Seems a long time ago now. Further submissions occurred during June and September 2023, and the hearings commenced on November 2023. And this is just a bit more detail of a timeline post those hearings, and you can see there the council requested a pause to Plan Change 14 in December 2023. That request was made to the minister, and then a memo filed. This is just getting into a bit of detail in December also, and the mayor met with the ministers on the 13th of February, and we got a letter from the minister requiring decisions to implement the NPSUD on the 28th of February. So that letter said continue on with the NPSUD, but was allowing a pause until December 2025 for decisions on MDRS. So I'll hand over to Mark now.
Thank you. So the letters from the Minister Bishop outline a process and extension of time for those areas deemed to be outside where we implement the National Policy Statement on Urban Development. What we're still waiting on, though, is a Gazette notice. A Gazette notice is a form of secondary legislation that formalises by Gazette what has been expressed in the letters. In short, we're awaiting that Gazette notice, timing to be confirmed. As John outlined, the Minister's first letter expresses that Council must implement the National Policy Statement on Urban Development by the 12th of September, specifically policies 3 and 4 that require greater building heights and densities in and around commercial centres. The Minister's second letter, the most recent one that John mentioned, then went on to express that outside those areas defined to implement the NPS decisions are required by December 2025 or next year. Between now and that milestone of December 2025, we anticipate there'll be a change to legislation to make MDRS optional. That's our understanding of MFE's program of changes that Minister Bishop has also publicly spoken about. The effect of the Minister's letters is that a staged approach is being put forward, and that staged approach requires Council to split its decisions. The first decision required by September this year is on those aspects of the plan change that implement the National Policy Statement. The second decision will be next year, and that's on the wider areas. And the best way to express this is by way of reference to a cookie cutter. The plan change that we started with and is being presented to the IHP is for the whole city. And to only implement the national policy statement in council's decision by September, we need to apply a cookie cutter, and council's decision would be on what is within the cookie cutter. Within that cookie cutter is effectively centres, particularly the central city and our larger centres, but also the land immediately around those centres. And the question that the council needs to consider, and subsequently the independent hearings panel when it makes recommendations, is how large that cookie cutter is and what shape it should be. That has regard to the distance that we take from centres of where intensification is enabled, but also the heights within those areas that is enabled. So within the cookie cutter, or the areas that are required to implement the national policy statement on urban development, MDRS, or medium density residential standards, which requires 3 houses per site up to 3 stories, that remains the baseline as a minimum. Our response within those areas cannot be changed to go down a different path of a different baseline on the assumption that MDRS becomes optional, because we don't have time to revisit what is being put forward by council within the cookie cutter areas. If we had more time, then we would potentially look at the baseline for heights within those areas defined by the cookie cutter, such that the starting point may be a lesser height than 3 stories, but the minister hasn't given any extra time beyond September to consider that. Beyond the cookie cutter, that's a decision for next year now. That will be dependent on the change being made to legislation to make MDRS optional, and we'll just have to wait to see what comes. There were, as part of Plan Change 14, though, other matters that implemented other aspects of the legislation and national policy statement, most notably the rezoning of Sydenham and its surrounds to mixed use from the current industrial zoning. Another aspect is requiring financial contributions for sites where the tree canopy is reduced or removed, and a payment is required to council in lieu of that to fund tree planting on sites nearby. Whilst the decisions required by September may be more straightforward in terms of defining the geographic extent, for those 2 matters in particular, because they extend city, in the case of financial contributions, that's a citywide matter. We need some direction from council on you confirming or otherwise that that should also be subject to a decision in September. So we'll come back to you on the 1st of May with a report making a recommendation of what will be put to the hearings panel on what should be in their September, in their recommendations for council to decide in September. And that decision will be pivotal in determining whether it should include financial contributions at a citywide level, or that that's focused just within the cookie cutter, and similarly whether the rezoning of Sydenham to mixed use should be enabled. Also, just to note that other plan changes, namely on heritage and coastal hazards, will follow after decisions are made in September on Plan Change 14. Those 2 plan changes go further than what would be decided on in September. Heritage, for instance, that plan change seeks to add protection to sites beyond the cookie cutter. It's about protection of sites across the city as well as on Banks Peninsula. And in terms of coastal hazards, that's about potentially limiting development rights beyond what the operative plan enables at the moment. So that's for a future decision as well. This slide, I appreciate, has a lot of words. This is an excerpt from the Independent Hearings Panel's recent minutes, which expresses that this was in response to a memo that the council had filed with the IHP to offer our thoughts on how the IHP could go about splitting their decision and methods by which that could be achieved. The panel recognised the assistance the council was seeking to make, but do point out the challenges of at this late stage unpicking all the different aspects of PC14, and they comment that it's artificial and too difficult at this late stage. But having said that, they recognise the merit of council offering some way forward for that. What the third point to take from this slide is that council will make a resolution on the 1st of May of what is put forward to the panel in the way of how it's split. That will then form part of council's closing right of reply or legal submissions to the panel. It's then up to the independent hearings panel of what they recommend. It's not for council's, what council puts forward to the panel isn't the deciding matter. It's what the panel determine is appropriate to recommend back to council. Council will then be asked to make decisions in September on those recommendations, but we will be to some extent restricted in what council can decide in September based on how the panel have put their recommendations to you. Those limitations are because council hasn't itself received evidence and read all the submissions, and for a change to be considered by council from what the panel recommend, we'll need some information to support that. So we'll come back to you with advice at a future date on that. In terms of next steps, next Monday, the hearings resume for 6 hearing days, and that will end the 24th of April. That's to recognise that the Minister requires decisions by September. The panel have already determined that given the evidence to date has been on the whole of Plan Change 14, that the remaining 6 days will be on the whole of Plan Change 14, not just those parts within any cookie cutter area. The panel have indicated their recommendations would be provided to council by the 19th of July, and thereafter we'll need to provide you with advice in light of receipt of those recommendations. Council then has to make its decision by the 12th of September, and if there's any matter that the council rejects from the IHP, so if the council disagree with anything the IHP has recommended and formally reject that, then the Minister has the decision on those matters. Amendments are expected, as I talked about earlier, to the RMA to make MDRS optional, the timing of which we understand to be later this year, but that's when the bill would be introduced, not when the new legislation would come into effect. And after any legislative change to make MDRS optional, it's then for council to make a decision on whether MDRS should be applied in those areas outside the cookie cutter or areas affected by the MPS. So that's the end of the slideshow. I appreciate there's complexity to this, like there always is, but happy to take questions.
Councillor McDonald.
Thank you. So can I just get this? This is really useful. Thanks for the presentation. So can I just get this right? So what we're saying is that so the government have said we can look at having MDRSs. We'll put it on pause until the end of 25, but because we've got to proceed with the MPSUD, we're going to have in those catchments MDRS still applicable.
That's right.
Yeah.
So there's effectively two stages. First, by September, council has to make a decision on those areas in and around centres, including, and that's the intensification, which has MDRS as a baseline, as you've noted. Yeah. And then beyond those catchments, it's for a later decision.
So then what? So then what happens if we get to the legislation coming in and MDRS being optional? Do we have the ability to remove MDRS from those MPSUD catchments or the cookie cutter catchments?
So when MDRS is made optional, which requires an amendment to the RMA, there's anticipated to be changes to various clauses, which one of which at the moment only allows council to have one intensification planning instrument, which is Plan Change 14. Assuming that is made optional, that council can do a subsequent plan change, then one option is for council to undo what it has earlier decided for MPS areas and to revisit the rules for those areas.
So, and probably just the final one is what's the alignment between what we're proposing and the minister's understanding of what he has indicated to the mayor, because it just seems potentially that it's MFE, isn't it, who are doing it. I just wonder whether we need to communicate something back relatively urgently to understand, just to be sure that the pause the minister's indicated he's willing to accept, that his officials are explaining the impact of that in some areas, because I wonder whether the timing of that might change if he was aware of those concerns. So have we?
So
where are we at? Yeah.
Officials that we've been meeting with since the mayor's meeting with the minister, what is being put forward of MPS areas being implemented and MDRS as a baseline is their expectation.
We've explained that to them, the implications, and they're clear about what this all means. The officials are, at least.
Yeah. Okay. I might need to take that offline, because that just seems very.
Councillor, yeah.
Cool. Thank you. That's great.
Councillor Johansson.
Yeah. Thank you. I mean, I'm just trying to kind of understand the bigger picture. The impact of this plan change means we're not doing any other planning work. Basically, for 2 years, we've basically not been able to do any planning work other than this. When are we? I'm just trying to understand how we kind of prioritize resources for this process versus the other things that we want done.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably better to delay that sort of discussion until the 30th, when we will come back to you on the broader plan change discussion, because then we can have a bit more detail.
Okay. But are we going to get options for increasing the resource so we can actually do the other stuff that the community want us to do as well, or that we've got resolutions to do, which is not currently happening?
Well, at the 30th of this month, we'll put forward our best advice to you around the broader program. Right. The reason this was given priority was that council had a direction from the government to implement the National Policy Statement on Urban Development by a specified date.
Yeah.
We couldn't depart from that and had to commit the required resources to make that happen. And as a cost of that commitment, it has given rise to a delay to other plan changes. But as John said, we can answer that more fully.
I wonder if, when you talk with the minister again, which I think you should, whether that could be kind of flagged that, it's just having for the benefits, it's having an enormous impact on us.
I'll just answer. So as part of we don't have any increase in budget proposed. So the discussion on the 30th is more around prioritisation of the work program.
Right. Okay.
There's nothing in the LTP to increase.
Is that to a council meeting or finance and performance?
It's an information session to begin with.
Okay, so we won't even be able to make decisions on the 30th. We'll need to wait for another meeting.
Yeah, it's an information.
How much is this? A final question. How much is this whole thing costing us, and what's the current budget for it?
Again, that might be a better discussion for the 30th if you want to know that information, because we'll need time to prepare all that.
Okay. Thanks, Yanni.
Certainly, we can provide a breakdown as we've supplied to the media and yourselves in recent months, and can provide an updated picture on that, which builds on the earlier update to you.
Yeah. Because the government was trying to reduce costs, I think. So,
thank you, Councillor Fields.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. It's just your comments regarding Sydenham, just to help me understand a little bit better. So assuming, let's just as a thought experiment, that there was a collective will around the table to make Sydenham mixed use. What are the roadblocks, or what are the potential kind of things that would sort of derail that in terms of what we've this whole process?
Yeah, so to some extent it depends on what's in the Gazette notice that the minister issues, but putting aside the procedural matter, the panel need to determine how they split their recommendations. That will be guided by council but also submitters. Our case for putting Sydenham forward if the case is made to put Sydenham forward for a decision by September, the case for it is that it's within a walkable distance of the city centre, and we're required under the national policy statement to enable greater heights and densities within a walkable distance of the city centre zone. So that's supports us rezoning it. That proposal to rezone it does go further, though, than what the National Policy Statement, Policy 3, requires, insofar as we're rezoning it to enable a whole range of uses rather than just allowing residential and greater height. We're putting a case to the, well, subject to council decision, we'll be putting a case to the independent hearings panel that rezoning of Sydenham is included in their recommendations on the basis that to rezone Sydenham can't be separated from the NPS requirement to enable greater heights within that area. So to simplify it, it's there's a case for making the change.
And when we're talking Sydenham, we're talking about the commercial industrial area between Morehouse and Brougham, is that correct? Yeah.
And east to west, what are the boundaries east to west?
I'll provide a map separately.
That'll be helpful.
Yeah.
Thank you. Cheers.
Councillor Keogh?
Yeah, so just with the intended outcome that they're after is the intensification around main centres mainly, isn't it? Okay, so it would just be good to see a little more carrot and stick, because what's happened is there's still developments going on in main centres and Wairiki Road at the Graham's Road shops there. There's brand new buildings gone in that are single story. That it's almost like every one of them centres around the city should have apartments above them, create security, gives the local shops, blah, blah, the whole lot would make sense on public transport routes. Is there ways that we can encourage that? Like, you almost don't even want to consent anything that doesn't have apartments above, and go the opposite and go for a period of time where anything going in that's commercial in those zones that has apartments above, we wipe the DCs. And so people go, you know what, I want to build apartments above shops in all of these centres because there's going to be no DCs, and it ticks every box. Why can we do anything like that in this?
So the plan changes the regulatory response or the stick. The carrot could be by way of waiving development contributions, for instance. I'll talk about the stick very briefly. That in the recovery plan post-earthquake for the city centre, there was a rule introduced that required a minimum of 2 stories. The proposed plan change increases that to 3 stories. The panel are very much asking experts the question on what they think about minimums. So planning traditionally has been about enabling, whilst we have requirements in the district plan about setbacks and so forth. It's one thing to enable residential developments. It's another to require that development's at least 2 or 3 stories. That has costs and benefits. The benefits are you get a more intense urban form. Costs, and there's other benefits, of course. A cost is that potentially sites remain vacant because the developer doesn't want to commit to a taller urban form than is required. But again,
well, it comes down to what's, and you have to talk to developers, but what is economically viable? Because the market ultimately dictates. You know, if your apartment in the 3-story building's $200,000 more, you're going to buy the one in the 2-story building because that's just math. You know.
So the panel are very much turning their minds to this question in terms of the regulatory response or the stick. In terms of the carrot and non-regulatory methods, that would be for a future conversation.
Yeah, just on that topic, that is something that's going to be looked at as part of the Greater Christchurch Spatial Plan and the priority development areas. So those priority development areas will look at those types of issues. Are carrots needed as part of incentivising things to happen in those particular areas?
Yeah, because one on that is if the objective is to go for 3, then you would only charge DCs on 2 stories.
Yes,
or
so
even
that
1,
yeah,
and then the other side, people go, "Oh, well, it's a no-brainer. Of course, I'm going to go to 3 because that it's gone both ways."
so they'll all be on the table. Those
So we'll see
considerations
all
as
that.
part of the priority development area work.
Brilliant.
plan.
Thank you, Aaron. Councillor Henstock, please.
Thank you. Can we double back to the IHP minute? Even the lawyer in me, I can't quite understand that. Can you just explain that in layman's terms, or do we not need to worry about it, given that the decisions for us as a council are actually later on?
The reason for drawing it to your attention was just recognising the IHP have expressed that in response. So firstly, the context is the council put forward a memo which set out that we'll do our utmost to assist the panel to guide the panel in splitting their recommendations. The panel responded first and foremost to say that's for us to decide how we split our recommendations. Council is one party in this process. We need to consider and.
So was it just a polite way of saying thanks, but no thanks, we've got this covered?
In short, but they also recognised that they saw some merit in council offering an approach which may assist them, but it comes back to their response being that it's a matter for the IHP to determine.
Thank you. Councillor McClellan, please.
I've never really had much of a head for planning issues, but can I just clarify my understanding? So is a likely scenario that we could have essentially those key town centres, presumably Hornby, Papanui, CBD, with the minimum, with MDRS as a baseline, and then we could opt out basically everywhere else in the city, and it would just be those key activity areas that would have the new planning rules. And if that is correct, is that such a bad thing from a planning perspective? Because it would force a lot more, it would intensify where the development was to go along the public transport corridor.
So the planning principles behind the national policy statement are to get greater intensification around centres and along public transport corridors. Putting aside the legislative framework that requires MDRS, that is appropriate from a planning standpoint because it promotes intensification where it's most accessible to employment, services, amenities, and supports the viability of public transport and developments that people living near to that benefit. So it makes sense. In terms of implementing the NPS, I talked about MDRS as a baseline. Being a baseline, it's 3 stories, but our response to that has been greater than 3 stories, recognising
6 or something like that.
That's right, recognising that the baseline is for the wider residential areas and within and around centres, it needs to be higher, recognising the greater level of activity and services and accessibility. The questions the IHP are considering is how wide do they go in terms of the catchments around those centres and how high is enabled within those catchments, and that's both within
and the buffer probably as well, right? To fall off.
Yeah. Although there's been a buffer considered between the MPS areas and MDRS, but if MDRS is not implemented beyond these MPS areas, then your baseline is back to the operative plan, which is in some cases 2 stories. So your difference between the MPS area, which may be up to 6 or even more, and the MDRS area on the other side, which is 2, is more stark potentially. Although there are rules like recession plans to manage that interface.
And can we make sure Helen Broughton's house is included in the key activity centre? Is that
just a reminder? This is a public session.
No comment.
Councillor Peters, please.
Thank you. The maps you mentioned earlier when you're answering Councillor Fields, is it possible to have those maps for the other centres like Hornby, Papanui, and so we can sort of see what the cookie cutter is going to look like and how far it's going to reach? I'm sure the community is going to be asking for some identity of what that cookie cutter might look like and how that might interact.
We're working as hard as we can to get that mapping produced in time for filing with the IHP by the 10th of May, when our right of reply is due to be completed and filed with the panel. The earliest that I could provide that mapping is when it's provided to submitters, including a lot of those that will have an interest in that by the 10th of May. So I can't provide it for the benefit of residents any sooner.
No. Are there any maps in existence already of the existing NPSUD scope and reach?
Certainly in our evidence to the IHP, we set out what distance should be taken from a centre for the purpose of greater intensification over and above MDRS. and how high that should be. So we've got a table that we can send you that summarises that.
Yep, that'd be handy. Thank you.
Thank you. Just a question, Mark. I was under the impression with MDRS after I'd left the Minister's office that the MDRS is like a carpet underneath the whole city, and we've just pulled the carpet out from underneath and rolled it up over there until such time as we know the rules and it can be optioned in or optioned out. Am I getting the impression that where your cookie cutters come down, MDRS is staying underneath NPSUD?
That's right. And so the carpet is still underneath within the area, within the areas to implement the national policy statement.
Okay, so one day when we decide to pull out of MDRS, we'll have to go through this all again to get the bits underneath gone, will we?
That will be a question for a future date because that will require reconsideration of the heights within those centres and immediately around those centres. If you take the carpet out, you're reducing the heights, but it's how much by. It's not necessarily just saying 3 stories should come out.
Because when I wandered out of the Minister's office, I was under the impression that the carpet was out and rolled up over there. So I'll just do a bit of checking on that later. That's right.
We had dialogue with officials on that matter, and
they had a different perspective on it because that's where we started the discussion. But they had a different perspective that it still applied.
Thank you. And lastly, Councillor Johansson.
Yeah, so I know that there's been a whole bunch of changes around what we can require in terms of car parking, but what I'm increasingly concerned with, in that like community ward last night, we had 2 streets that we're having to put yellow lines in because service vehicles can't service anymore because of the intensification and people can't actually move safely or access properties. Is there any work going on looking at the kind of cumulative impact of the intensification and the services or the access for service vehicles, emergency services, and actually safety for traffic? But I get that we can't require minimum car parking anymore, but there's a whole bunch of other stuff happening in these areas that is having very adverse impacts on communities. And I'm just wondering, like, who's actually monitoring or tracking the intensification that we've got happening and what the consequences will be with even more?
So staff are doing some work in that space. What's of utmost importance is having the data and evidence and using other tools beyond the district plan. So with the district plan no longer having minimum car parking requirements, we're reliant on other methods, namely for our suburban centres, suburban parking policy, which is triggered when streets are reaching a threshold of parking demand. Now, in order to implement that policy, we need to understand how much parking demand is there and what are the drivers of that. Is it intensification, or is it because of a school, or is it or other factors? And we've been collecting data and analysing that with the view to understanding the correlation between intensification and parking demand.
I guess I understand the parking stuff, but I don't understand all those other things that are impacting, like safety, access, services. The wheelie bin system is a classic example, where the trucks can't actually go down the streets anymore because it's so congested with cars.
So recognising that it's a multifaceted issue, you've got parking, you've got wheelie bins, you've got limited space in the roadway. There's also a desire from communities for more trees in the road space. We're advancing work and we'll be reporting to council in the next month or 2 about a planning program, which is to look at what's called local area planning, and that's looking at a more localised level and developing responses by way of a plan that then has actions in it, both regulatory and non-regulatory, to address it, and that treats the space as a whole rather than just looking at each issue in isolation, such that as an outcome of that plan will be a direction for how we design our streets potentially.
Thank you. That's brilliant. Thank you very much. That's good. Thank you for the update.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, everybody, we will be back here at 12:30 on the dot. Thank you.